The day I finally understood what kind of man my father-in-law was, I was standing in his driveway at 7 in the morning, and he was looking at me the way a landowner looks at a tenant who has forgotten his place. I was 31 years old. I had been married to his daughter Vivian for 4 years. I ran a small but growing architectural consultancy out of a converted warehouse on the east side of the city, employed 6 people, and had recently won a regional contract that my accountant described as life-changing. None of that mattered to Reginald. None of it had ever mattered. To him I was a man of uncertain origin who had attached himself to his bloodline without adequate credentials, no family name he recognized, no inherited wealth, no network that intersected with his own. I had appeared in Vivian's life during graduate school and staying, apparently, was something I had not been permitted to do. Reginald was 63 that year, the kind of man who had constructed himself so completely out of status and certainty that there was no visible seam between the person and the performance. He was the third-generation owner of a commercial property group that managed half the downtown office towers in the city. He had the face of a senator and the voice of someone who expected rooms to quiet when he entered them. They usually did. I had met men like him before, in client pitches and industry events, and I had always found them legible. Their confidence was the product of a particular kind of inheritance, and once you understood that, the performance lost its power. What I had underestimated about Reginald was not his arrogance. It was his patience. He had been working against me from almost the beginning. I didn't know that yet, standing in his driveway that autumn morning. I knew only that Vivian had asked me to drop by because she and her father were having breakfast and she wanted me there. I had driven over with coffee and a box of pastries from the place on Merchant Street that Vivian loved, and I had stood at the front door feeling slightly foolish holding a bakery box while Reginald looked at me over the roof of his car with the expression of a man who had arranged something I wasn't yet aware of. "Ethan," he said. Not warmly. Just my name, dropped into the morning air like an item being removed from a list. Reginald. I matched his register. I had learned early not to shrink in his presence. Shrinking only confirmed whatever he had already decided. He went inside without another word, and I followed, and Vivian was in the kitchen looking at neither of us with the careful neutrality of a woman who had grown up between 2 competing gravitational fields. She kissed me on the cheek. She took the pastry box. She poured coffee for all 3 of us with movements so practiced they were nearly automated. That was the texture of our early years, me arriving in spaces where I was tolerated rather than welcomed, Vivian performing the role of bridge, Reginald conducting a quiet, methodical campaign to remind me of what he considered my insufficiency. He never did it crudely. He was too intelligent for that. He did it in the language of omission, the business events he mentioned to Vivian without mentioning to me, the family decisions discussed and resolved before my input could be offered, the way he would reference the future of Vivian's life with a proprietary ease that placed me outside it. Vivian, for her part, loved us both in the way that people love 2 things they have decided should coexist but don't know how to force into alignment. She deflected when the tension surfaced. She changed subjects with the agility of someone who had been doing it for decades. And for a long time I believed that her deflection was a form of loyalty to our marriage, that she was simply navigating a difficult parent rather than choosing between 2 allegiances. I was wrong about that too. But it took me years to see it. What I know now, looking back on that morning in the driveway, is that Reginald had already spoken to someone. He had already made a phone call I would only discover the existence of 2 years later, in a document that would arrive in my lawyer's office on a Tuesday afternoon and reframe everything I thought I had understood about my marriage. That phone call had set something in motion, quiet, precise, patient, and I had been standing in its shadow for years without knowing the shape of it. The morning felt ordinary. That's the thing about the beginnings of significant endings. They almost always do. Vivian and I had built something real in the years between the wedding and the unraveling. That matters to say. The marriage was not a fiction or a mistake, it was a genuine attempt by 2 people who loved each other to make a life, and for long stretches it worked in the way that good things work, imperfectly, incrementally, with enough warmth to sustain the effort. We lived in an apartment on the third floor of a narrow building near the river, the kind of place with tall windows and unreliable radiators and a view of the water that made winter bearable. Vivian worked in arts administration. She managed programming at a mid-sized contemporary gallery, a role that suited her precisely because it placed her between the world of objects and the world of people, which was where she was most comfortable. She had an eye for beauty and a gift for organization, and she brought both to our home in ways that made it feel curated without feeling cold. We had a routine. Saturday mornings at the farmers' market on the South End. Sunday dinners sometimes cooked together, sometimes ordered in, depending on the week's residue. Evenings often spent in separate rooms pursuing separate interests. She read, I drew, and we would emerge around 9 and spend an hour talking about nothing consequential and then go to sleep. It was not a dramatic life. It was a chosen one, and the choosing had felt, for years, like enough. The first sign that something was shifting arrived so quietly I very nearly catalogued it as nothing. Vivian began spending more time at her father's house. Not dramatically more, a Sunday dinner that extended into Monday morning, a weekend trip to the lake house that Reginald owned 2 hours outside the city, an afternoon that started as a quick visit and became an evening. She always had explanations. He was dealing with a difficult tenant dispute, he was having the east wing of the lake house renovated, he needed her to review some documents on behalf of the family trust. The explanations were plausible. Reginald's life generated genuine demands on her time, and she was his only child. But I noticed that she returned from these visits differently. Not upset, not visibly troubled, but with a quality of distance about her, as if some interior conversation was continuing after the exterior one had ended. She would sit across from me at dinner and be present in body and largely absent in attention, and when I asked what was on her mind she would say, nothing, just tired, with the specific ease of someone who has rehearsed the answer. I noticed, also, that she had begun handling her phone differently. Not hiding it, nothing so obvious, but carrying it in a different pocket, keeping it face down on surfaces where previously she'd left it face up. Small adjustment. The kind of thing that doesn't register as significant until you've collected enough of them to see a pattern. There was one evening I remember with particular clarity. We were in the kitchen after dinner, the dishes being cleared, and her phone lit up on the counter with a message preview. The name displayed was one I didn't recognize, F, which could have been a contact nickname, an abbreviation, anything. She crossed the kitchen in 4 steps and picked it up before I'd registered that I'd seen anything, and the movement was slightly too swift, slightly too purposeful to have been unconscious. I said nothing. I turned back to the sink. In the window above the faucet, I could see the reflection of her face as she read the message, and the expression there was complicated, not happy, not frightened, but the face of someone receiving information they had been waiting for and were not entirely glad to have received. Later that night I lay awake and did the thing that overthinking people do. I constructed a variety of explanations for everything I'd noticed, ranging from the benign to the catastrophic, and then I deliberately chose the most benign ones and tried to believe them, because the alternative, that something was being concealed from me in my own marriage, in my own kitchen, was a thought I wasn't prepared to follow to its conclusion. Vivian slept beside me with her usual stillness, and the river outside reflected the city's lights in long, wavering lines, and I told myself I was constructing problems from nothing, which was a thing I sometimes did, and that the best response to uncertainty was patience. I was not entirely wrong about that. I was, however, choosing patience for the wrong reasons. It was my business partner, Celeste, who first suggested that I look more carefully at my own professional life before focusing entirely on my marriage. Celeste had co-founded the consultancy with me 5 years earlier, and she had the particular perceptiveness of someone who watches things closely without appearing to. We were having lunch near the office on a Wednesday when she mentioned, almost in passing, that she'd received a strange inquiry from a former client, a property development firm that had been one of our first major accounts. They'd contacted her to ask why we had declined their renewal contract. We didn't decline it, I said. That's what I told them. She looked at me steadily. They said they received a communication from our office indicating we were no longer taking clients in their sector. The email came from a personal address, not our domain. It looked convincingly official. I felt something cold settle in my chest. I asked her to forward the inquiry. When I read the email they'd received, supposedly from me, professional in tone, regretful in language, entirely fabricated, I recognized the architecture of it immediately. It was designed to lose us business without looking like sabotage. It was the kind of thing someone might do if they wanted to diminish rather than destroy, to create a slow leak rather than a rupture. I had 3 more conversations with former clients over the following 2 weeks, quietly, carefully. 2 others had received similar communications. One had been told, by a third party he trusted, that my firm was under financial investigation, a complete fabrication. The third had been approached by a competing firm 3 days after we'd submitted a proposal, and the competing firm had somehow known the precise details of our bid. Information had been leaking. And the leak was close. I spent a sleepless night considering who had access to our internal documents, our client correspondence, our proposal drafts. The list was small. My thoughts kept landing on one name and skidding away from it, because the implications were too large and I wasn't yet certain enough to follow them. Then Vivian came home from a Sunday at her father's house with a new bracelet on her wrist. Gold, delicate, expensive looking. She said her father had given it to her for her birthday, which was still 6 weeks away. When I mentioned that seemed early, she said he'd seen it and thought of her. When I looked at the bracelet more closely the following morning, turning it gently in the light while she slept, I recognized the jeweler's mark on the clasp, a boutique on the north side that specialized in custom pieces. Not the kind of thing you bought impulsively for an early gift. That afternoon I went to the boutique under the pretext of purchasing something for a client's wife. The woman behind the counter was helpful and discreet, and she confirmed, when I described the bracelet, that a piece matching that description had been commissioned 3 months earlier as part of a larger order. She couldn't tell me more than that. But 3 months earlier was precisely when the false emails to our clients had begun. I drove home slowly, taking the long route along the river, watching the gray water move under an overcast sky and trying to assemble the shape of what I was beginning to understand. It wasn't a complete picture yet. Too many pieces were still missing, or still ambiguous, or still plausibly innocent if examined individually. But a shape was forming, and the shape was troubling not just because of what it implied about Reginald, a man I had always understood to be an adversary of a particular kind, but because of what it implied about Vivian. She had been at her father's house when the first email was sent. I checked the date against my memory, and then against a photograph she'd posted that same afternoon, time-stamped. I didn't confront either of them. I called a private investigator named Theo, a referral from a lawyer I trusted. I met him the following morning and gave him everything I had, which was still mostly inference and coincidence. "Give me 2 weeks," he said. He had the unhurried manner of someone who had seen this category of problem before and knew its particular geometry. He needed less than 1. Theo was methodical in a way that felt almost gentle, as though the truth were a fragile thing and needed to be approached without sudden movements. His first finding arrived on a Thursday afternoon in the form of a file containing financial records he'd obtained through legitimate channels, public filings, corporate registry searches, land transaction records. What they showed was this: Reginald's property group had, over the previous 18 months, made a series of quiet investments in 3 parcels of commercial real estate on the east side of the city. The east side, where my consultancy was located, where 2 of our largest clients operated, where the regional contract I'd won was centered. Reginald was not simply trying to diminish my business. He was maneuvering to acquire the space my business occupied, professionally and literally, while undermining my capacity to resist. The second finding was harder to look at. Theo had tracked the source of the fabricated emails through technical forensics I didn't fully understand but trusted implicitly. The access point was a device that had connected repeatedly to our office server, not through our system, but through a shared cloud storage account that Vivian had access to because we'd set it up jointly, years ago, for shared household documents. She had shared access with someone else. The device ID resolved, eventually, to a tablet registered to an address I recognized, Reginald's Lake House. Vivian had not sent the emails. That much was clear. But she had given her father the access that made them possible, and the timing, 3 months of patient, targeted sabotage, suggested she had known what that access was being used for. I sat in Theo's office reading this, and I remember the quality of silence in the room, the particular quiet of a space where important information has just been delivered and there is nothing useful to say in response to it. Theo sat across from me and didn't fill the silence with anything, which I appreciated. "There's one more thing," he said eventually, and slid another page across the desk. It was a record of wire transfers from an account in Vivian's name into an investment vehicle controlled by Reginald's property group. Not enormous sums, not the kind of amounts that require reporting, but consistent, monthly, extending back almost 2 years. The investments were structured as a minority stake in one of the East Side parcels. Vivian had been financially invested in her father's plan to acquire the territory my business depended on. I had been, without knowing it, surrounded. The red herring I'd been chasing, the contact, on her phone, the mysterious early gift, the late visits to the lake house, none of it was an affair in the romantic sense. There was no third person. The betrayal was more architectural than that. It was structural, patient, conducted in the language of property and finance rather than passion. And it was a collaboration. Not a coerced one, from what I could tell. A chosen one. I thought about the morning in the driveway and the look Reginald had given me over the roof of his car. I thought about every dinner where he'd referenced Vivian's future as though I were a temporary variable in a longer equation. He had always been playing a longer game. I had simply never believed that Vivian was playing it with him. I went home that evening and made dinner. Pasta, from scratch, the way Vivian liked it, the labor of it occupying my hands while my mind worked quietly in the background. When she came home she kissed me on the cheek and poured herself a glass of wine and asked about my day in the easy, familiar way of a woman who believed the situation was under control. "Good day," I said. "Yours?" "Fine. Dad called. He wants us for dinner Sunday." "Sure," I said. I set the table. I served the pasta. We ate together in the apartment above the river, and I was very calm, and very present, and entirely decided. I had already called my lawyer that afternoon. I had already authorized the work that needed to be done. The documentation Theo had assembled was thorough enough to be admissible. The financial picture was clear. The timeline was irrefutable. I didn't say anything over dinner. I had nothing to gain from a scene, and everything to gain from clarity. Reginald had spent years teaching me, without meaning to, how a patient person operates. I had learned the lesson. The Sunday dinner at Reginald's house was the last one I attended. His dining room was a room designed to communicate security, high ceilings, heavy furniture, a long mahogany table that could seat 12 and usually seated 3. Vivian sat between us in the way she always had, and Reginald poured wine with the ease of a man presiding over something he owned, which in his mind extended to the people at the table. He was in good spirits. He made a comment about the East Side Development Corridor, how the area was finally maturing into its potential. He glanced at me as he said it, not with malice, with something subtler, the satisfaction of a man who believes a strategy is proceeding exactly as designed. I held his gaze and agreed that the East Side had real potential. He raised his glass slightly. I raised mine. The following Tuesday, my lawyers filed. The documentation named Reginald's property group in a claim of tortious interference, using fabricated communications to damage existing business relationships, and presented the financial records connecting the sabotage campaign to the East Side property acquisitions as evidence of coordinated commercial misconduct. The claim also referenced the shared cloud account access as the mechanism of the intrusion. Vivian's name was not in the filing. That was a deliberate choice on my part, one my lawyer had questioned. I'd thought about it for 3 days before deciding. She had participated. She had made choices that caused real damage. But she was also his daughter, shaped by 40 years of his particular gravity, and I was not interested in destroying her, only in separating from a situation that had been constructed around my removal. She called me at 9 on Tuesday evening, after the papers had been served. Her voice was very controlled in the way that voices become when the person is preventing something from happening at the surface level. "Ethan." A pause. "You didn't have to do this." "I know. I was standing at the window, watching the river. I did it anyway. He's going to fight it. He's welcome to." I said it without heat, which I think surprised her. She had perhaps expected anger. I had moved past anger several weeks earlier, somewhere on the long drive along the river on the evening I'd come back from the jeweler's boutique. Anger was useful for a while and then it became a weight, and I had no interest in carrying it. "Ethan, I didn't," she stopped. Started again. "I didn't think it would go this far." That sentence landed differently than anything else she might have said. Not "I didn't know." Not "I wasn't involved." "I didn't think it would go this far." Which meant she had known. Which meant she had watched and allowed and hoped it would resolve itself short of the point it had reached, which was a particular kind of complicity, the kind that hides behind deniability until deniability becomes impossible. "I know you didn't," I said. "That's not really the point." Another silence. The river below moved steadily in the dark. "What happens now?" she asked. "The lawyers talk," I said. "After that, you and I talk. And after that, we figure out what's left." I didn't specify what I thought would be left. I had my own sense of it, clear and unsentimental. But I wasn't going to have that conversation on the phone, in the aftermath of served papers, in a moment when neither of us could see the other's face. Reginald, for his part, reacted as powerful men tend to react when challenged on their own ground. He assembled a legal team, released a public statement through his firm's communications office characterizing the claim as a misunderstanding between family members, and called Vivian twice that evening to discuss strategy. She told me about those calls 2 days later, and the fact that she told me at all was the first sign of something I hadn't been sure I'd see, a fracture in the alliance. What Reginald had not understood, in all his careful patience, was that his plan depended on Vivian remaining entirely on his side. It had not occurred to him that the exposure of the plan, the moment it became visible rather than invisible, would force her to actually choose. He had constructed a situation in which choosing never became necessary, because the endgame was supposed to be accomplished before I understood what had happened. He was a man who underestimated the value of being underestimated. The legal proceeding moved with the particular pace of commercial litigation, measured and relentless. Reginald's lawyers attempted to reframe the fabricated emails as a misunderstanding, then as an unauthorized action by a rogue employee, then as something else entirely. Each reframing required a new explanation, and each new explanation contradicted the previous one, and by the 4th month the posture had shifted from defense to settlement discussion. I was not present at those discussions. My lawyers were. I was, during that period, working. I had secured 2 new clients in sectors adjacent to the damaged ones. I had renegotiated the regional contract and expanded its scope. Celeste had tracked down the competing firm that had received our leaked proposal and confronted them with the evidence of the breach. They had quietly settled rather than face their own exposure. The consultancy was not just recovering, it was growing faster than it had before the sabotage began, partly because the process of defending it had forced me to understand it more precisely. Vivian and I had filed for divorce in the 3rd month. It was not dramatic. It was 2 people acknowledging a conclusion that had been reached some time earlier and documenting it formally. We met once, in a cafe near the river, neutral ground, both of us careful and civil, and had the conversation that the phone call couldn't contain. She was honest in a way she hadn't been during the marriage, and I respected that. She said she had told herself that her father's interventions were protecting her future, that my business was riskier than I acknowledged, that she was being prudent rather than disloyal. She said she had known, somewhere she didn't look directly, that this was not entirely true. She said she was sorry. I believed her. It didn't change anything. Some apologies arrive too late to function as repair, they can only function as acknowledgement, and acknowledgement, at least, is something. The divorce was finalized cleanly. I kept the consultancy, which was mine alone in any legal sense. She kept what was hers. Reginald's settlement with my firm included a financial component that effectively funded a year of expanded operations. He had, in his methodical attempt to diminish me, financed my next chapter. I found that quietly satisfying in a way I didn't say aloud to anyone. 3 years is not a long time in the abstract. In lived experience, it is the distance between one version of yourself and another. After the divorce, I moved to a larger space, a loft on the top floor of a building near the river, further east than the old apartment, with windows on 3 sides and enough room for a proper drafting table and a library and a kitchen designed for someone who actually used it. I had always been a decent cook, freed from the compromises of a shared life. I became a deliberate one, the kind of cooking that was more meditation than task, which I found useful in the year that followed. The consultancy grew in ways that felt both earned and slightly improbable. We expanded to 9 staff, then 12. We won a national award in year 2 for a cultural center project that had begun as a small commission from a nonprofit I'd supported without expectation of return. Celeste took on the role of managing director with a competence that made me realize I should have formalized the arrangement years earlier. The East Side offices that Reginald had coveted ended up serving as the anchor for a creative district that attracted 3 other architecture and design firms. The tide had lifted all the boats, and the boat I was on had caught it early. I did not follow Reginald's story closely. I heard things, as one does in a small industry, that the settlement had cost him more than money, that the public record of the litigation had affected his firm's reputation with certain institutional clients who valued discretion above all, that he had retired from active management 18 months after the case closed and installed a deputy who was, by all accounts, more competent and considerably more scrupulous. I heard that he was unwell in some general way, the accumulation of decades of a certain kind of pressure, and I felt for him something that surprised me, not satisfaction, not residual anger, but a kind of detached recognition. A man who builds his empire on control eventually runs out of things he can control. The body is usually the last thing to comply. Vivian, I heard about less, and less frequently as time passed. She had left the gallery and taken a position with a foundation in the south of the country, something connected to public arts programming. Someone who knew her mentioned once, in passing, that she seemed well. I was genuinely glad to hear it. What she had done was real and it had cost both of us, but she was not a person constructed entirely of that one choice, and I had no interest in reducing her to it in memory. I was not lonely in those 3 years, but I was mostly alone, and there is a difference that matters. I dated occasionally, a landscape architect I'd met at a conference, a writer I'd been introduced to at a gallery opening who turned out to be funnier and more perceptive than anyone I'd spent time with in years. Nothing became serious, and I didn't push anything toward seriousness, because I had learned something about my own rhythms that the marriage had obscured. I needed time between chapters to understand what the previous one had meant. Then one Saturday morning in October, 3 years and 2 months after the divorce was finalized, I answered the door of my loft to find Vivian standing in the hallway. She looked older in the way that good-looking people look older, not diminished but clarified, as though the years had removed some unnecessary softness and left something more defined underneath. She was wearing a coat I didn't recognize and carrying a paper coffee cup and looking at me with an expression I had no easy category for, not hope, exactly, and not apology, but a kind of watchful honesty, as though she had decided before arriving that she would not pretend to know how this would go. "I should have called," she said. "Probably," I said. "Can I come in?" I looked at her in the doorway for a long moment. Not because I needed time to decide, the decision had settled in me with the particular quietness of things that are simply true and don't require argument. But because I wanted to be present for the moment, to mark it, to let it be what it was rather than rushing past it into whatever came next. No, I said. I don't think so. She didn't look surprised. That, too, told me something. She had come knowing it might go this way, which meant she had come for herself as much as for us, to close something rather than to reopen it. I just wanted to say that what I did was wrong, she said. Not complicated, not contextual. Wrong. And I wanted to say it to your face. I know, I said. I appreciated the call 3 years ago. This too. She nodded. She looked past me into the loft for just a moment, the light through the 3-sided windows, the drafting table, the overfull bookshelves, and something passed across her face that I couldn't fully read and didn't try to. You look well, she said. I am, I said. And I meant it without qualification, which was the truest thing I'd felt in a long time. She left. I stood in the doorway and listened to her footsteps descend the stairs, heard the building's front door open and close below, and then there was only the sound of the city through the open window and the particular quality of a Saturday morning with nowhere I needed to be. I made coffee. I sat at the drafting table and looked at the current project, a community library on the west side, a commission I'd pursued specifically because it asked something of me I hadn't done before, which was the criterion I'd started applying to new work. The drawings were good. The client was intelligent and collaborative. The building, when it was finished, would be used by people who needed it. That felt like enough. More than enough. It felt, actually, like the right scale of a life, not Reginald's scale, not the scale of property empires and inherited dynasties and rooms designed to communicate dominance, but the scale of work that left something useful in the world and people treated with enough honesty that they knew where they stood. Reginald had spent years convinced that I was a man who could be arranged around, reduced, edged out of the picture through the patient application of resources and leverage. What he had never understood, what I suspect he was constitutionally incapable of understanding, was that the qualities he had read as weakness were not weakness. The willingness to be patient, to work without recognition, to build without needing the room to go quiet when you entered it, those were not deficits. They were the thing itself. I thought about him sometimes, in that office in the south of the city that he no longer ran. I hoped, in whatever general way one can hope for someone who caused real harm, that he'd found something resembling peace. The machinery of his particular life, control, acquisition, the management of other people's futures, was not a machinery designed to produce happiness. It was designed to produce security, which is a different thing, and a poorer substitute. Outside, the October light was the particular gold of late autumn, the kind that makes everything look both beautiful and temporary. I drew for 2 hours, and then I called Celeste to talk through a client presentation, and then I went to the farmer's market alone and bought vegetables I would turn into something good that evening, and the day was full in the way that chosen days are full when you have finally stopped filling them with the wrong things. I didn't close the door that morning with triumph or grief. I closed it gently, the way you close a door on a room you finished with, not angry at the room, not in love with it anymore, just done with it. That was the end of it. That was, also, the beginning of everything that mattered. What makes this story more unsettling than a conventional infidelity narrative is that the betrayal was never romantic, it was architectural. Reginald didn't simply disapprove of Ethan, he constructed a campaign of strategic erasure, quiet and patient and thoroughly planned. And the most painful dimension of it is not what he did, but who helped him do it. The first red flag Ethan missed was the sheer regularity of Vivian's visits to her father, not the visits themselves, but the quality of her return from them. She came back different, carrying some interior conversation she wouldn't share. A person processing family obligation comes home tired. A person carrying shared secrets comes home guarded. The distinction is in the texture, and Ethan noticed the texture without trusting what it meant. The second flag was the contact's name, F, on her phone, which Ethan spent too long interpreting through a romantic lens, looking for a third person, a lover, when the betrayal was actually seated at the head of the dinner table every Sunday. That misreading cost him weeks and kept him investigating the wrong dimension of the problem. The instinct to look for an affair was understandable, even reasonable, but it was shaped by the assumption that the only betrayal a wife could commit was an emotional or sexual one. He didn't yet understand that what Vivian had done was more complex than that, a slow, financial, strategic alignment with her father's interests over her husband's, conducted in the belief that it would resolve itself before becoming visible. The first genuine turning point was Celeste's discovery of the fabricated client emails. That shifted the story from the territory of marital suspicion into something more concrete and, paradoxically, cleaner evidence. Once the sabotage became documentable, Ethan's position changed entirely. He was no longer the suspicious husband constructing problems from inference. He was a man with a file and a lawyer. That shift, from emotional uncertainty to legal clarity, is what allowed him to act without fury, which is the detail that ultimately separated his outcome from Reginald's expectations. Reginald had anticipated an emotional reaction. He had not anticipated a methodical one. The second turning point was Vivian's sentence on the phone, "I didn't think it would go this far." That admission didn't exonerate her, it implicated her more precisely than denial would have. But it also cracked the alliance. Reginald's plan had required her to remain entirely committed to a version of events that could be sustained only as long as Ethan didn't fully understand what had happened. The moment he did understand, the version collapsed, and she was left holding its pieces. That moment of collapse, not the filing, not the settlement, but that one sentence, is when her father's control over the situation ended. The lesson that emerges from Ethan's half of this story is not about vigilance or strategy. It is about the relationship between patience and power. Ethan had been taught, throughout his marriage, to read patience as passivity, his own quiet manner read by Reginald as an absence of strength. The lesson he demonstrates by the end is that patience is not the absence of force, it is force waiting for the right moment to be precise. The lesson from Vivian's half is harder. She made choices she told herself were pragmatic and protective, and discovered, as most people eventually do, that sustained self-deception is not actually protection. It is preparation for a reckoning. What the story ultimately reveals is something about the inheritance of power, how it shapes the people who grow up inside it, and how it blinds those who wield it. Reginald never saw Ethan clearly because he was looking through a lens calibrated to his own world, a world where status is inherited, where worth is demonstrated through networks and names and the ability to make rooms quiet. Ethan existed entirely outside that taxonomy, which meant Reginald could only read him as a deficiency rather than a different kind of strength. That misreading became the source of his own undoing. He built a campaign against someone he had fundamentally miscalculated, and the campaign produced, in the end, exactly the opposite of its intended result. Vivian's trajectory is equally revealing. She grew up in her father's gravity and had never fully found her own center of weight. The choices she made, allowing access, making investments, not intervening, were the choices of a person who had learned to defer to a dominant force rather than develop independent judgment. Her visit to Ethan's door 3 years later suggests she had, in the interval, found something resembling that judgment. Coming to close a door honestly, without hoping to reopen it, is not a small thing. It is the kind of act that becomes possible only after some genuine reckoning with oneself, and the fact that she did it matters, even if it changed nothing between them. Perhaps especially because it changed nothing between them. The reconciliation that doesn't happen here is not a failure. It is its own kind of resolution, the recognition that some damage cannot be undone, that acknowledgement is not restoration, and that the most honest ending is sometimes the one where nothing is reclaimed but everything is seen clearly at last. What I find most quietly painful about this story is not the sabotage, and not the legal battle, and not even the divorce. It's the Sunday dinners. All those Sunday dinners where Ethan brought pastries and poured wine and sat at a table that was already, unbeknownst to him, arranged against him. He kept showing up. He kept trying. And the people at that table kept letting him, because his presence served their plan and his absence would have interrupted it. There's something in that worth sitting with. Not as a warning about in-laws or marriage, but as a reminder that the people who underestimate us most completely are sometimes the people sitting closest to us. And the truest form of quiet strength is simply continuing to build something real while they're busy assuming you won't.